Hello, hello. Welcome to the Takedown, Subverting Power, Radical Thought. I'm your host, Nick. Nick Nowlin, actually, is my full name. Just kind of want to remind everybody that I'm glad to be back. And here we like to radicalize the minds, and we like to examine stuff and really do like a deeper dive on it. So I know, it's been sporadic, as always, really. I want to say recently, but no, I've always been a little bit sporadic. But I wanted to get this video out. I want to start having a conversation about it and really start getting into these issues. So we're going to talk about Charlottesville. That seems to be, kind of on the nation's mind right now in the public spectacle and in the public space as a sphere of discussion. So I think it's important that I go ahead and start, kind of giving my thoughts about it. And it's been a while. It's been well over, a week. So I've had time to kind of let my thoughts kind of marinate and mature rather than having like a knee-jerk reaction right off the bat, like right when it's fresh inside their mind. But I'm going to go ahead and start off by saying, welcome to America. This is America. What's that song? This is America. Yeah, this is America, people. And I think one of, and I'm just going to be honest, I'm going to start using this word a lot today. White supremacy, one of its greatest achievements was that it was somehow able to cloak itself to the moderate individual or to people who are largely ignorant or just, passively accepting of the status quo. Like it's been able to cloak itself and appear as though it's disappeared. And, I hate to say this, but white supremacists were never really beaten. If you want to talk about the context and history of this country, since the founding, white supremacists have been in control. They've been in power. They've always been running stuff. From day one. They got their right to own slaves in the Constitution. They had to make sure everything, their protection of property, and the right to property and the right to own people as property was enshrined in the Constitution. And you mean to tell me that somehow something that powerful was just gone overnight because somebody uttered some words or some people had some marches? No. That's not how this works. And if you're not operating from a place that accepts that what we saw this weekend is the normal state of America, you're operating from a place of delusion. Like what we saw there is an extreme version of how many white Americans see themselves. I'm going to repeat that. What we saw this weekend is an extreme version of how many white people see themselves in America. Keep in mind, you're talking about protests, you're talking about mass demonstrations, you're talking about people actually willing to go outside in the South, in the hot sun, in the middle of the summertime, and shout and stand around in the sun because they believe in some cause. And no matter how noble the cause, no matter how horrible the cause, as in what we're talking about right now, there's a very select few people who are actually willing to get out there and do that type of stuff. But let's not be fooled. Just because a select few people were willing to get out there and do that doesn't mean that they're a fringe group. And that's what I see out here. I see a lot of talk about, well, these are fringe individuals. These people are just the fringe. No. I'm willing to bet that this is a good, 20 or 30% of the pop. And here's what I'm basing that off of. I'm not basing it off of these people are overtly racist or anything like that. There's an ideology that comes with this. And it doesn't necessarily have to tie itself down to skin color, because skin color is not really what it's about. It's really about money. It's really about money. But ultimately, the skin color is used to sort of manipulate certain people into doing certain things. But ultimately, it's about money. But I'm going to digress there because I don't want you guys to lump me into the camp of people who say that, that race is not a real issue. And I've repeated multiple times that race, while not a real thing, has very, very real consequences and implications. So I'm going to separate myself from that by saying, ultimately it is about money, but at the same time, there's an ideology that comes with it. And that ideology is sticky. It's powerful. It has social power. So these are things we have to kind of understand. And these people are out there chanting stuff like, we will not be replaced. I'm proud to be white. You will not replace us. And I'm taking my country back, as if it's been anybody's but theirs from day one. This is a very strange thing to me. It's unbelievable. Unbelievable. So, a lot of people are talking about Donald Trump and his comments. I'm going to be real with you for just a split second. In all honesty, what did you expect Donald Trump to do? I mean, did you expect him to issue a strong denunciation of what he saw, even though those are the people that voted for him in many respects? Like, what does Donald Trump have to gain for siding with black people? Are black people going to start voting for Donald Trump? I don't think so. I mean, if you're saying it's about being a decent human being, I'm going to say, wake up. What world do you live in? These are politicians. They're not decent human beings by default. These are people that make calculations based on what they feel they need to do. His base of support is largely indifferent to the suffering of black people, or outright overtly racist against black people. So what is he supposed to do? I mean, he gains nothing by coming out and standing against this stuff, but at the same time, he could stand to lose a lot by siding with people that would never vote for him anyway. So what did you expect him to do? So I'm just going to throw that out there, and I know everybody's going to hate me for saying that, but I mean, look, is Donald Trump wrong for doing what he did? Yeah, he's wrong, but this isn't about right or wrong. This is about political calculus for him. And I think, as far as I'm concerned, if I were in his shoes and I had, if I was a rich white billionaire who was supported by white supremacists and indifferent white people to go to office, what benefit is there for me to stand up for the rights of black people when they didn't vote for me? Especially when my base is literally against those things that they're fighting for. What benefit is there for me to do that? Just being a decent person? Now, y'all know that's not how this works. So there's no reason to even, what I'm saying here is there's no reason to even be bothered with what Trump had to say. There's no reason to get caught in the media circus by saying like he's emboldening white supremacy. No. He's a politician. He's a standard bearer. He has a constituency. They support him, and he's not going to talk shit about them on national television just to make you feel better, even though when you're not going to vote for him anyway. That's just how that's going to come down to it. And I think people trying to make it seem like it's anything other than that are disingenuous at best. Like, to me, it's the same thing as people telling Bernie Sanders he has to denounce Bernie Rose and all this garbage. Why should he have to denounce people that vote for him? Why does he have to denounce people that support him in favor of people that would never support him anyway? Like, start thinking about like how politicians kind of do these things. Like, you don't give your opposition power over you by basically giving in to their demands, even though they're not going to vote for you anyway. You do the stuff you want to do for the people who voted for you and supported you. That's what you're there to do. You're not there to kowtow to the other side, because that's what Barack Obama did. That's what it looks like. You're trying to give Republicans stuff because maybe they'll decide to vote for you, and you don't want them to feel bad because they lost. But really, you kind of move away from what you're supposed to be doing. You're supposed to be advocating for your constituency. And it's the same thing I would expect from any type of leftist president. I would expect them to basically deliver to the left things without regard for what the right has to say about it. And tough titty, excuse me, I shouldn't have said it that way. When I meant to say tough luck, that when a right-wing president comes in, he delivers to his constituents that, we get all offended when his constituents are antithetical to what we're pushing for and what we're fighting for. So that's just kind of the way I see that as far as Donald Trump's comments are concerned. And I really don't want the conversation to kind of stay there, because I mean, I could even go further with this. I could even say, well, what if Donald Trump said all the right words? The attack would still be something along the lines of, well, he didn't really mean it. There's no policy behind it and blah, 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 blah. So really what we're talking about is, are you really concerned about what he said in the speech, or are you concerned about his policy? because his policy ultimately is going to reflect what really actually happens, and the speech is really meaningless. Let's flip that. Let's say you had Hillary Clinton up there and she gave a strong denunciation to what happened, but there was no policy change. Is that effectively any different from what Trump did? Is it? Is it really? Is a politician's speech that makes you feel good or makes you feel better any better than somebody who's going to give you no speech and not do nothing for you? I mean, I guess, if you really just want to hear those words spoken and it just, you want to get that high, that's fine. But ultimately, politics is about policy. Politics is about, changing the material conditions for people doing stuff, right? Not just speeches. Speeches and flowery language and all that. That stuff is great, but you got to have some policy to back some of this stuff up, or at least some attempts at policy, generally. So, as far as I'm concerned about that, the idiots out there chanting, "I'm proud to be white," and they're taking the country back, and you will not replace us. That's America, and that's where we've always lived. And I think the quicker we start to reconcile that history and that understanding, the better off we'll be in trying to confront these things and deal with them in any type of rational way. Because right now, it seems like a lot of us are still believing in magic. We still want to believe in, the idea that, Black people, if you just work hard enough, you'll rise above all that's arrayed against you. And all it is a personal problem. Well, no, this is a systemic problem. This is a systemic problem. And there's no amount of magical Negroes that are going to rise up enough to lift our whole community out of the situation. And I know there's been plenty of other commentators that have said this exact same thing. I've always been a subscriber to it. And I just like the way they describe it when they say, believing in the exceptional Negro. I think that that's the wrong thing if you're talking about bringing up a community. So now let's talk about like your typical responses. And we're going to start with the right, and we're going to kind of migrate around, because I hate to say it. The responses to this issue are problematic all the way around. And I'm going to try to address a lot of the common stuff I've been hearing and the stuff that I really key in upon. And today's not going to be a very, very long episode, ladies and gentlemen. Today's going to be a shorter episode. I'm going to have an interview with a professor, and we're going to talk more in depth about these things a little bit later. I'll keep you tuned. That could be as soon as tomorrow, or it could be, next month. But we're going to kind of talk about, this issue kind of arose around a statue, like a Confederate statue. And this is not the first time that this has been going on, whether it's the Confederate flag and these monuments. Everybody's trying to take down these monuments and people are fighting to keep it up. And one of the things I keep hearing that really irks me is they say things like, this statue is about remembering our history. It's like, well, okay. The reason why that sounds like a plausible idea is because you don't really understand what statues are for. If it was just about remembering history, we would have statues for random shit that happened whenever, all the time, because you just want to remember it. It's about remembering history, right? So, yesterday, a car crashed into this building. Now we got a statue up. That's really not what history is about. Like, a serial killer murdered 35 people and we finally caught and killed him, or caught him and put him in prison, or whatever else happened. There's no statue to that serial killer. We don't immortalize, because we don't immortalize these things. That's what statues are for. They're for immortalizing and honoring people, places, or things. That's what statues are for. Somebody does something great, you put a statue of them up, so that long after they're gone, there's a statue that stands as a testament to their legacy, what they left on the world, what they did. If it's a place, something that happened at that place. If it's a thing, why that thing was important, who it affected, what it did, how it changed the course of history. That's why you put statues up. So the question is, why do we have memorials to the Confederacy? Why do we have memorials to the Confederacy? To me, to be honest with you, it seemed kind of odd. Like, personally, when you learn about history, and I understand the teaching of history changes over the years. Like, when I learned history, even here in Texas, they still taught that Black people were slaves, not migrant workers. And that, slavery was a terrible institution. It was, watered down, as it always is in the history book, right? It's watered down. And then when you get in college, you learn about the real atrocity, things of that nature. And then post college, you read, scholarly work on the same issue, and you get a completely different perspective, right? But ultimately, like, those steps don't occur for everybody. So what I think needs to happen here is the schools need to start teaching this stuff correctly. And that means not having, your textbooks teach people that, slaves were immigrant workers. They weren't immigrant workers, they were slaves. And the institution of slavery is not, I think one of my teachers used to always call it the peculiar institution of slavery. And that was just a nice way of saying a savage, revolutionary institution of slavery. Because, American slavery is very unique in how it was done, and the things that kind of went on around it is very unique. Like, that had never been done before, stripping a person of their humanness, stripping them of their culture, stripping them of everything down to just being a number or a piece of property for someone else, and having that matriculate down through generations like that. That was just a strange thing. And so he refers to it as peculiar, but it really is grotesque and savage. And I think understanding that history and what it means and how horrible it is right now is good. It's a mark of progress, but not understanding that history and getting out there and fighting and saying things like we have to preserve our history and that these statues are a part of history and, we just need to remember it and celebrate it. It's like, no. There's nothing about the Confederacy that needs to be celebrated. And, what's interesting is I went back and I actually tried to look. There was a graph, and I wish I was really, really good with the production. I would put a graph up for you. I'll probably post the link in the comments here. There's a graph that talks about like the period in which all these monuments went up. I think it was in a major news report, a major news publication. Like, I think it was on one of their websites where they talked about when these monuments actually went up. And it showed like I want to say like a bar graph, but it was with dots. And like the more dots, that means the more monuments that happened in a particular year. So you can see like the bulk of the monuments, they were erected from in between 1890 and 1950. And even in that sliver, even though that represents the bulk of the statues or the monuments, most of those were between 1890 and 1920. And it's just like, well, what was going on during that time? That was a time in America of intense labor struggle. And when you start thinking about the regions of the labor struggle and how it played out, you remember the South was somehow, sort of like left out. Like they fought for the labor here in the South, but the South ended up, not the South, but the business owners in the South ended up prevailing over labor in the South. And they were able to do so by exploiting racism of white workers. So they will basically go in and stoke racial division in between the white workers and black workers and basically keep them apart. And that resulted in basically the South largely being a union-free zone. That really was a bulwark against unionism in the South, was the fact that the business owners were able to play on racial tensions in order to make that happen. So I think that when you recognize that, and then you understand at the same time, this was in the middle of Jim Crow. This is in the middle of Jim Crow, 1890. The Reconstruction ended in 1877 when the North made that compromise to actually pull out of the South in order to get their president to be president. And because of that compromise, while Democrats may have won the presidency, really, I would say largely African Americans lost out on that deal, because the point of Reconstruction was to try to force some sort of integration, try to dismantle the Southern way of life, so to speak. And when I say Southern way of life, I really mean the subjugation of the Negro in Southern society, was really an effort to try to dismantle that system and put in place a system where they will try to bring the Negro forward in some sort of equitable position, or a better position than what they were in basically taking them out from under that subjugation. And I'm sorry for basically, kind of stuttering there. I want to say three different things at once, but it happens, right? So That's what happened during that time. And it seems like once Reconstruction had ended and the white institutions were able to, reconfigure themselves, reassert their power, subjugate the Negro once again, what did they do? They turned and they began to, erect these statues on public land and on state infrastructure to let everyone know who held power in this region, who was powerful here. Those statues are there as a testament to white dominance. That's really what they are. They're to remind everyone where you are, and to remind specifically Black people where they are and who runs that area. That's what those statues are for. And when you start saying like this is about history, you're missing the point. It's not about history. It's about dominance. It's not about, remembering something or honoring soldiers who died. No. This is about dominance. This is about asserting that dominance and having it stand there as an affront to the people that you oppressed. That is what those statues are for. And so I'm not sure why anybody has any problems with what I just talked about. Like, this should be, not controversial. And I also want to point out, when I said that a lot of those statues were put up in between 1890 and 1950, I also want to say that, in between 1950, well, I would say even come in between 1920 and 1955, 59, 60-ish, it seemed like, I would say about 55-ish, it seemed like there weren't really many statues put up during that time period. I mean, and this is during the time there was like a huge infrastructure boom. You had parks, and you had the first, bill start nationalizing parks and to preserve federal land. There's a lot of infrastructure spending going on at this time. And this is almost leaking into the post-war period. Actually, it is leaking into the post-war period. Leading up into that point, you really didn't have a lot of Confederate monuments put up during that time. But guess what happened? Late 50s through the 60s, you start seeing a resurgence of those monuments being put up. And the resurgence kind of coincided with the struggle for civil rights in America. Again, this reinforces the case that these statues are not about history. These statues are about asserting dominance, because it seems like they kind of rose up as a backlash to Reconstruction and asserting dominance, and then they kind of subsided. And then as soon as Black people start struggling for civil rights again, they rise up again in response. It's really not necessarily about history, because it would be constant if it were about history. It would be like a constant thing. It's not at all. A lot of this stuff was put up, particularly the ones put up in the North, and I hate to make this sound like I'm saying the North was doing good for Black people and the South was doing bad for Black people. That's not what I'm talking about at all. I'm not making a reductionist argument about that. What I'm talking about is regional specifics. Like, in this region in the 60s, they put this statue up to remind Black people that even though this isn't a Confederate state, like the Confederacy or the ideas behind the Confederacy or white supremacy in general is still dominant in this area. Don't make claims. Don't think you're equal. Don't try to do anything to lift yourself up, because you don't run this. I mean, that's really what they're trying to get through wherever they put these monuments up. And I really hate having to keep saying that. And I'm saying it over and over and over again. I don't like repeating myself like that. But if there's nothing you remember for this show, is remember what I'm saying. These statues, remember what these statues are for. Remember who these statues are shown to, who looks at these statues and what they think. And then think about the periods and the context in which these statues were put up. So that's all I'm going to say about the statues, as far as like their historical significance, their historical context, and like what they're really there for. And when you start saying stuff like, oh, it's for history and all that, you're just ignorant. You don't know no better. And that's fine. It's okay to be ignorant. There's plenty of things I'm ignorant about. I'm ignorant about, nuclear physics. I don't know anything about that. But because I'm open and I know what I don't know, I don't just make simplistic arguments because they sound good. I defer to somebody that may actually know a little bit more, or I take the time to educate myself on an issue before having a reaction, an emotional reaction. And I understand that emotions can be manipulated. So I try to keep calm and try to be logical and methodical and take my time when I'm making these arguments. So I think, if I can do it, I think, we can ask other people to do the same, particularly when it comes to these statues, and just try to take their own emotion out of it, because the statues aren't for them per se. They're for asserting their dominance over another people. And so the statue may just be a statue. And since I just said that, let me move on to another common thing I hear. Public property. No, I'm sorry. There are ways to take down a statue. So an argument nowadays is like, rather than saying, well, I don't disagree with taking down the statue, but there are ways to go about doing it. There are ways to go about doing it. And then I would ask that person, seriously, how can one take down a symbol of white supremacy in a white supremacist nation? How can you do that the right way? What do you mean by the right way? Because, ultimately what you're saying when you say that is you mean you have to do it in a way that it does not offend people who basically pay homage to white supremacy. And I just don't think that's possible. I do not think that taking down a symbol of white supremacy in a white supremacist nation is possible. I don't think that it's possible to do that in a way that doesn't offend white supremacists. They want that statue there. They want that dominance to always be projected. And they are going to kick and scream. They're going to complain. They're going to make up all sorts of random ass arguments about why you shouldn't take that statue down. But ultimately, there's no way to do this without offending them. And you know what? To be honest with you, you're going to offend them. And that's something they just going to have to live with. They just going to have to live with it. Grill it up. Whatever beef they have, they can grill it up and eat it. Because the statue's going to have to come down. And what's so weird is people will say, well, it's just a statue. It's not a statue to me. My people were brought here as slaves, brutalized, whipped and beaten, women raped, killed, children hung from trees, men hung from trees for hundreds of years. And you want to tell me it's just a statue? I guarantee you, if the roles were reversed, they'd say a different tune. But that lack of empathy, that lack of an ability to see from the other person's shoes and understand the history and context behind that statue is a problem. It is a deep problem. And it's something, again, I've said this, but it's something we really have to look at and understand when we're talking about some sort of solidarity, at least on the left. I really don't expect much from the right, because I've already expressed this on my show many times. I just think a right-wing ideology is a thoughtless ideology. I think it's about emotion and manipulation. But when you actually start to think about what you're actually saying, and you actually start to look at the history or the results of what you've actually done, none of it makes any sense. None of it. You say you want freedom, but you want to hand over basically everything to the corporations, the antithesis of freedom. Like a corporation is literally, a fiefdom or miniature monarchy or something like that, that's run by a few select individuals, maybe even just one individual, depending on who it is. And they have absolute power over everything, and everybody else has to basically bow down to them. But you say you want freedom, but you want to hand over everything to a structure that's antithetical to freedom. So the question is, do you know what freedom is? Not going to get heavy on philosophy. I'm not even a philosopher. I'm just asking a simple question. Do you know what freedom is? Because if you really want freedom, what you're doing is the exact opposite when you empower corporations. But that's not even what we're talking about today. Let me actually go to my next point. They'll say stuff like, well, you don't want to vandalize public property. And America has a very, very weird history with the idea of owning property. Like, for some reason, property is considered sacred for some reason. And, discounting the fact that, people were once considered property, and that the word property is fluid and it changes. There's still a weird reverence for property. And to be honest with you, for somebody that doesn't own much, if you don't have a pot to piss in, why are you concerned about people's property? Like, you don't own property. Most of us really don't own property like we really own property. Like we need to be concerned about property. Like property needs to be number one for us. Most people aren't in that situation. Most people are not in that situation. I'll repeat it again. Most people are not really property owners in the same sense that Bezos is a property owner, that Bill Gates is a property owner, that Donald Trump is a property owner. We're not property owners in that same sense. Property isn't like number one for us because we don't have a lot. We really don't have very much at all. And then when you talk about in comparison to those people, we have nothing individually. And even collectively, we have a lot less than we should. So property is a tricky issue. But now when you're talking about public property, you know, it gets a little hairy, right? Because obviously you don't want people destroying public property, but at the same time, you can't have a public sector that completely disregards the experiences of an oppressed people within a group, right? And erecting these statues as a symbol of dominance. So like, you know, that whole argument about property rights and being sacred and things of that nature, I think it flies in the face of like justice. Like, do you care more about property rights or do you care about justice? Like, do you care more about property rights or do you care about doing what's right? And I think mixed into that, this idea that property has to be sacred is also a reverence for the law. You know, there's a lot of times like, well, the rule of law and order, you know, that's something that privileged people kind of cling to because the laws aren't really, laws and morality are two different things. Laws and justice are two different things. Like when you start talking about rule of law, you start talking about property rights and things. This is for people who have a lot of money, who own a lot of property to protect. These, you know, the law is really like a system that the wealthy use to basically curb the attitudes and behaviors of people who don't have any money. You know, that's really what it is. And the second it becomes inconvenient to them, the law, it doesn't exist. Like when they want to do something and the law is in their way, they either change the law because they write the law in many cases, or they just break the law with impunity, and it doesn't really matter because the law wasn't meant to apply to them. It was meant to apply to somebody like me or somebody like you. So the law is fungible. It doesn't mean shit to them. So why do we have this reverence for the law as a regular person? There's no reverence for the law. You know, there's a quote from Thurgood Marshall, and I know he's acting as somebody who interprets the law and things of that nature, but I think it kind of plays itself out in the social realm as well. Like he said, sometimes you just have to do what's right and wait for the law to catch up. And I mean, just being honest with you, there's no truer words than that. So I'm gonna basically move on from that one. It's a silly argument to me that people are more concerned about some statue at public property, which was scheduled to come down anyway. All they're going to do is throw it away. They're not going to do anything with that statue. People are scared or concerned about that. They're more concerned over that statue than somebody being run over by white supremacists at a rally. They're more concerned about that than all these weird laws that are being passed to make protesters more easily able to be run over. It's like, so let's put that into context too. There was an interesting article where they talked about these laws and where they're going. And you notice that wherever they're being passed, it seems like, you know, protests were breaking out in that area. And so there's this immediate rush. Legislation immediately rushed through to change city ordinances or even state law to say that, okay, if you run over somebody who's out protesting, you know, as long as you exercise due care, who knows what due care means? That's open to interpretation. And we know how the legal system tends to interpret Black lives as not being worth anything. So what that means is if you run over somebody and they just so happen to be Black, or they just so happen to be out there protesting for some left-wing cause, it'll be tolerated by the legal system. That's essentially what it can turn into. Now, as with laws, you don't always say like, oh, it's an ironclad thing. I'm not really getting into that. I'm not really trying to interpret the law, right? I'm just saying, like, I think that it could be possible that such a thing could occur. And I think it's kind of dangerous to have that kind of stuff out there. So that's what I want to say about that as far as like a reverence for the law, a reverence for property rights. That's all bullshit. Like, The law is not sacred. It's not, something that's not fluid and changing. And to be honest with you, the law has to evolve. And sometimes the law is behind what we need to have done. And as we can see, the opposition or the right, whatever you want to call them, they understand the law's purpose and they change it to suit their needs. And we need to understand that as well. Like, we should be fighting to change the law and put it to our needs. And if the law is not shaped for us, or it's not in a form that we can use currently, sometimes you're just going to have to break the law, but be right on justice and understand that that's what it takes to kind of push forward a real social justice an agenda. So ultimately, a person's life is more than a statue. Like, this is a statue, they pulled it down, nobody was hurt. Like, community outrage shouldn't be centered on the statue, but it should be centered on, individuals who may have been injured or who may have lost their lives. Because statues, it can always be replaced. If we want to replace it, it can always be replaced. So, but people can't be. So I think there should be more outrage about the people who died than there should be about, just a statue that got pulled down or some racist symbol that was up that somebody decided to take down. It's just a weird thing. So the last thing that I hear is, you want to respect their right to protest. I have no problem with anybody's right to protest. I understand that protests are not supposed to make people feel comfortable. I'm not supposed to be comfortable when, that Scarborough Baptist Church goes to the funerals of fallen veterans and screams, what's that word I'm looking for? They scream epithets at the people and the families. They call them faggot and things of that nature. It's really horrible what they were doing to service members and their families at their funerals. It's a really, really horrible thing. And I understand, based on that, I understand that, protest or whatever they were doing, really almost come borderline harassment is not always to make you feel comfortable. Just like, when people are blocking the street protesting something, you have to get to work. It's annoying, but ultimately, social unrest kind of lays with institutions. It is the responsibility of institutions to maintain the peace, to keep our society cohesive, to keep it running. And that doesn't mean by getting out there with billy clubs and SWAT team and tear gas and beating people down and suppressing that right to protest. That means hearing people's protests and proposing policies which will alleviate the material conditions that have them out in the streets in the first place. And I think when you're dealing with America, which is, first and foremost anti-Black and extremely racist, Black people largely have been cut out from, the centers of power. And we have basically politicians and powerful individuals who are either indifferent to the plight of Black people or outwardly hostile to them. And these are the people that are, making decisions. All these protesters that are out here, these are not just the poor white people like they always want to make it seem like it's only poor white people out there. No. These are doctors. These are lawyers. These are judges. These are kids of the well-to-do, college students, programmers, entrepreneurs, business owners, police officers. These people are people who have power in institutions and in the state itself, who have an ideology that says that Black people are worthless, that they're less than, and that them, for virtue of the color of their skin or whatever they base it off of, whether it be hair color, height, whatever, they are superior. That is what these people are doing, and they're exercising their power individually and collectively, with that being their dominating theme, unconsciously or consciously. We've got Supreme Court justices saying that Black students don't belong in the higher level institutions because they learn too slow or X, Y, and Z, and they wouldn't be able to keep up with the faster pace. That's bullshit. That doesn't make any sense. Especially when you know that, there's accreditation boards for every university on colleges and on basically college degrees. Basically, there's an accreditation board, and they do each one. There's for engineering, there's ABET or ABE or whatever it is, IEEE. They're they actually give accreditation to programs. And because of that accreditation process, that makes sure that people who show up with these degrees, everybody knows the quality of education that you've had, what kind of coursework you've had, what kind of things you have experience with, is because of these accreditation boards. And that also means that there's not a vast difference between what's taught at, say, U of H or UT. There's not a big difference between what's taught at those universities. So, the comment just goes to show you how an ideology of white supremacy is dangerous in that this person has a lot of power, and he's exercising that power within the framework of that ideology. And then on top of that, we'll tell you that all Black people have to do is rise up and pull themselves up by their bootstraps and make better for themselves and do better for themselves when you have people like this actively using their power to hold them down. It's a very strange thing. The reason why you don't succeed is not because I'm actively holding you down. It's because you're just sorry. And because you're sorry, I can never go easy on you. I always have to give you the harshest punishment. I always have to pay you less than your white counterparts. And then I'm going to tell you it's your fault that you've earned this. And I fundamentally believe that, everybody who's like me is superior to you. But, you're okay. You just have to pull yourself up by your bootstrap. You're where you are because you're lazy and you're sorry. Doesn't make any sense. Thoughtless ideology. Once again, thoughtless. None of it makes any sense. So on top of that, I'm going to go back to my original point here. I kind of went on a little rant there because I wanted to kind of tie all that stuff in so everybody can understand where I'm coming from when I say this. But even on top of respecting somebody's right to protest, like, this is not a protest group. This is people who are involved in these white nationalist groups. And sure, not everybody is guilty of this kind of stuff, but they are supporting an ideology that was used by, maybe even some of the same groups that have a history of terrorizing people of color in the United States. These are people who lynched people for little more than walking through their neighborhood and having a gun, or deciding to open up a shop or a store, or owning a good piece of land. They lynched people for stuff like this. They bombed churches, murdered children for having the audacity to try to fight for self-determination. That is the history of white supremacist groups in the United States. And what's weird is that globally, whenever you have like oppressive, dominant groups or racialized people that are suffering oppression, there's always like a role for these right-wing militias, or they're like a secret police or Gestapo or a gang of people that go and they beat up on racialized groups. And what they're doing is they're basically they're serving a role. They're making sure that the right-wing state is dominant, and that they keep people from basically being able to determine their own fate. They keep people from asking and fighting for self-determination through fear. It's the harsh end of social control, but it is a form of social control. And when you're thinking about these groups, there's global examples for this, and there's historical examples for this, where you have right-wing groups like this that are more or less tolerated. Like, white supremacist groups have been around forever. They've always been terrorist organizations, but there's never really been a concerted effort by law enforcement to disrupt them, to infiltrate and to monitor them, to curtail them, to curb what they're doing. There's never really been a substantial police force aimed to do that. There was a report back in the 90s that said that we're seeing a large rise in these groups and we need to do something about it. It never went anywhere, because the government, the state itself, will tolerate these types of groups because they serve a purpose. Even and we like to think of the centrists as like people that are going to save us and protect us, or people of color in general, from the racist right wing or right wing militias or nationalist groups, but they don't. What they do is they offer lip service, but they haven't marshaled any kind of forces to curtail these groups, because these groups have power. And ultimately, groups with power can exert it on both the right and the left, and make sure that their interests are taken care of. And their interest is in suppressing people of color. That's what their interest is. And so it doesn't matter if the Democrat gets in there or Republican gets in there. Ultimately, until we the people have decided that we're going to stop doing that and stop supporting those types of things, can we start getting some kind of change? And that change is going to be rough. It's going to be very, very, very hard. Like, you're going to be bumping up against a brick wall, so to speak. But that's just what has to be done. Now, back to what I was talking about when I talked about right-wing mobs. Their purpose is to beat you and make you scared. And so you run to the centrist liberal and say, well, I don't want them to be in control. I don't want people supported by them to be in control, so we vote for you. The centrist gets in there. They don't do anything about the right-wing groups. They just keep on doing business as usual. Now, let's say something breaks out. They'll offer some words. They'll offer a lot better words than Trump did. But what will they do that Trump did not do? Nothing. They're going to do the exact same thing. Nothing. And they gave you some lip service and it made you feel good in the moment. And then instead of talking about, self-defense or saying like, okay, well, people need to rise up and defend themselves. If the state's not going to defend us, they want to talk about peace and forgiveness and turning the other cheek. And they have all these people on here like Van Jones and all that crying on TV. I can't stand Van Jones, by the way. Like I've never liked him. And I think, as a whole, people like that shouldn't really be listened to very much just by nature of being black and being on TV. Doesn't mean you understand what you're talking about or what you're doing. Like he just, has glasses and wears a suit and he's on TV. So people listen to him, but maybe we shouldn't. But have him up there crying. And instead of talking about black people, what did he do? Talked about his Jewish mother. Who cares? What is this? It's the weirdest thing. The weirdest thing to me. But to sit there and have him crying on national TV, he didn't talk about like what we should be doing. He didn't talk about like these white supremacist groups and how they should be probably curtailed by the state. He didn't talk about, the true purpose of statute. No, he talked about his feelings individually. And that's what they want you to do. They want you to talk about your feelings individually. And that's problematic and it's not a good way to go. But look at that. I'm running out of time and I really want to get to the left side of this. So I'm going to probably talk about right-wing violence and right-wing mobs getting more or less tolerated by the state. I'm going to talk about that probably in another episode because that's a really important topic and there's a history there. And I want to lay out a timeline for everybody so we can understand what I'm talking about when I say that instead of just speaking about it generally. So I'm going to speak about it more specifically in another episode. But let's go to the left. And this goes even from the neoliberal left all the way to like the people that consider themselves the most progressive. Like they'll talk to you and the neoliberal left will tell you race is everything, but they won't actually do anything about it. They just say because you're not saying race is everything that you don't know what you're talking about and that the black people should vote for them or people of color should be voting for them. But then you have the further left, the more progressive side. Economically, they'll say things like, well, race isn't real. Race isn't real. Or like, if you want to talk about race, you're just being the same thing as a neoliberal left. It's like, no. There is a depth to a racialized politics that the neoliberals don't have. And in order to form a coalition with people that have a racialized politics, it will behoove you to probably go a little bit further than having that, real paper thin understanding of racialized politics. Maybe to understand that perhaps, even though race is a social construct and it's not a real thing, it's a social construct that has very real consequences. And that perhaps, when people are complaining about race, if you would just merely listen to their concerns and make sure that they're incorporated in a strategy that's going to achieve what you wanted to achieve, that maybe you can form a stronger coalition. And what I mean by this is like whenever somebody starts to talk about race, I hear people say, well, that's just divisive. It's a tool used by oligarchs to control and divide people. It is a tool used by oligarchs to control and divide people. But it's not the oppressed people that are the problem. It's the privileged people that are the problem. By saying that our issues are unimportant, you are being divisive. We're willing to support what you want to support if, in exchange, you address these issues that we're trying to address. If your response is, well, I can't do that, that's too divisive, you just need to focus on this because this will affect you as well, that's not being a good ally. That's not being in a coalition. That's not unifying around a collective set of issues. What that is basically trying to unify into a politics of dominance where you still dominate that other group, but you need them to accomplish your goals, but you don't want to give them anything. And to be honest with you, if you're doing that, you're really not much different from the neoliberals. it almost comes a little bit paternalistic when you explain it that way. And I'm not saying some people don't understand where their bread is buttered, and some people may not understand all the intricacies of policy. I'm not saying that at all, because you're right. Some people don't understand. Some people do need to be educated. But guess what? There is a real critique there that exists beyond that. And you just have to be able to look between and look further than somebody who's just saying, we need to have more black people in office, rather than somebody saying, no, we need to have black people lifted out of poverty, the whole of the community lifted out of poverty. There's a difference between those two. Like the black faces in high places, it's just another form of the exceptional Negro syndrome. That's not going to do you any good. That's what you identify as a neoliberal identity politics, and you want to stay away from that. And I agree with you wholeheartedly. But at the same time, you shouldn't be confusing that with people who are saying, hey, black people largely exist as an underclass in America, and that underclass is rooted in the racialized history of the United States and the oppression that they have suffered across hundreds of years. We need some actual things to, we need some actual policy to try to alleviate and remediate these things that have basically happened to them, to basically offer something up in recompense to these people and their basically their descendants who have suffered these things from generation to generation to generation. You should be able to distinguish between those two politics and be able to say, okay, I can go with the latter, but I'm going to basically dismiss the former. And the fact that we find that many white leftists or many leftists in general, not necessarily white, can't do that is problematic. And that's why there's so much division there. You're making it easy for them. You make it so easy for them when you can't actually be open to probably understanding that the way the status quo is right now, it benefits you in ways that it disadvantages others. And that in order for you to make a coalition with those others, you're going to have to both give up those advantages and try to do something about the disadvantages of other people and bring each other to like some sort of parity, and from that parity work together to solve the issues that you need to solve, right? And that's really what a coalition is about, coming together as equals, not coming together as a privileged group and an oppressed group, and we're supposed to come together to do something that a privileged group wants. That's not a real unified thing. That's not really politics. That's not coming together as equal. That's coming together as, I don't know, master and servant or something. It's weird. So race is not a real thing, but it has very real consequences, and failing to deal with those consequences because it's divisive is not the problem of oppressed people. That is the problem of the privileged people. That is a privilege problem, and that is not their fault. That is your fault. If you're watching this and you're feeling guilty or something like that because you don't necessarily agree, or you don't feel the same way, but you just wish that you can just have some kind of coalition, everybody come together. No. Coalition takes work, and everybody's gonna have to put in work, including Black people or people of color will have to put in work to accommodate, but you're gonna have to put in a lot of work as well in order to make that coalition happen. And it's always been my dream that such a coalition would come into existence. But I think when you start off the argument talking about race is divisive, we can't let them divide us. No, we are divided. We're divided by our material conditions. So unless you're really willing to reconcile that, face it, understand it for what it is, and be willing to engage in a process by which you say, okay, well, this is wrong, and from now on, moving forward, we're not going to do that anymore. And at the same time, we're also going to look back and try to make things right from sins of the past until you can really come together around that and have a real socioeconomic justice platform that exists beyond just prison. You're really going to have a hard time building the coalition you need. If you want to have a class-based politics, you're class-based politics. If it's really going to call itself socioeconomic justice, it really needs to be racially sensitive because we have a racialized past. And there are people in America whose race decided their class. So that's really all I want to talk about, in the wake of Charlottesville. And I'm going to basically leave us with a quote here. And this is from, of course, MLK. He's got a lot of great quotes, but from MLK being bounced around right now. But I'm just going to read it straight off. It says, "First, I must confess that over the last few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the strive towards freedom is not the White Citizens Council, or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, 'I agree with the goal in which you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action,' who paternalistically feels that he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by the myth of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait until a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance, it's much more bewildering than outright rejection." So, I mean, dissecting that quote and what he's talking about, like in my own politics, not only do I see the racial aspect, but I also see it as the same problem we have on the left in general. Hey, we don't want to fight for single payer right now, because right now we really need to focus on, the public option or the ACA. We have to defend against the ACA. Basically he's making an argument that, sometimes justice and peace are not the same, that the absence of tension is not necessarily good. There is a such thing as a peace that's negative, being oppressed and not fighting back, or a peace that can be positive, which is a presence of justice. Like he's basically laying it out. Like, I would try to paraphrase this, but there's really no real way to paraphrase what he just wrote there. It speaks volumes to itself, and it speaks to where we are today. So I want you guys to think about that quote, think about what it means, think about the politics, and we'll see you again next time. Have a good night. Oh, can you open it back up? Oh, guys, I forgot. Once again, I want to take this time to remind you guys that we do have the Takedown channel. I do have also my Twitter page at the Takedown, Nick. Follow us. Please engage with us in conversation there. Like, I really want to encourage, my following to grow. We really need to start scaling this stuff up. I have some time now. I'm going to be making a lot of changes in terms of production value and what we're going to be doing here. So stay tuned for that as well. Thank you. Have a good night.